If you've ever wondered what happens when political decorum clashes with raw, unscripted truth, then you're in for a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive into the moment that shook the political establishment, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. We want to know, do you think a person's private life is fair game in a public debate? The air in the Washington, D.C. ballroom was thick with a specific kind of anticipation, the kind reserved for power, influence, and the past glories of a political icon. The high-profile policy forum was a carefully curated affair, a stage where old guard leaders could share their wisdom with a new generation. Every detail, from the polished mahogany podium to the carefully spaced seating, was designed to foster an atmosphere of intellectual reverence and unquestioning respect. The audience, a mix of seasoned journalists, eager interns, and well-heeled donors, leaned forward in their seats, ready for a deep dive into the familiar themes of economic recovery and social progress. Then, heat took the stage. Barack Obama, the former president, still possessed the easy charm and magnetic presence that had once captivated a nation. The applause was a wave of adulation, a rhythmic sound that filled every corner of the room. As he stepped to the podium, a knowing smile played on his lips. He let the applause subside, a master of pacing, before glancing down at his notes. He chuckled slightly, a casual, almost off-the-cuff gesture, and the audience, sensing a moment of wit, quieted. "We used to have public servants," he began, his voice a smooth, familiar cadence. "Now we've got reality show contestants married to who even knows what." A light, but not entirely comfortable wave of laughter rippled through the crowd. It was the kind of laughter that follows an edgy joke, a sound born of obligation rather than genuine amusement. But beneath the surface, an undercurrent of something much sharper coursed through the room. The dig was not a generality, it was a targeted insult with a clear name. Everyone in that room knew exactly who he was talking about. 2 rows from the stage, a young woman sat motionless. Her name was Karoline Leavitt. Seated beside her husband, a quiet man who had the sturdy, disciplined bearing of a military veteran, she froze. The smile she had held just moments before vanished, replaced with an expression that was unreadable to those around her. But inside, a fire erupted. Her hands tightened around the armrests of her chair, knuckles white, her jaw locking into an unyielding line. The crowd had been ready to move on, to treat the insult as just another political quip, but Karoline wasn't. Unbeknownst to the audience, cameras backstage caught her leaning in, her lips forming a silent, urgent command to her team. The words were not a request, but an order. "Get me on that stage right now." In that moment, a line had been crossed, a challenge had been issued, and a quiet, unassuming woman had just made the entire narrative.
In a moment that defied every unspoken rule of political theater, a woman of unyielding conviction rose from her seat. The polished ballroom, just seconds before, a sea of polite applause and knowing nods, was now plunged into a bewildered silence. Karoline Leavitt walked toward the stage, not with the rehearsed confidence of a scheduled speaker, but with the purposeful stride of someone who had just decided to write her own script. The audience watched, transfixed as she passed the rows of stunned journalists and high-profile attendees. This was a rare, unscheduled counter-response, an act of defiance that no one had dared to imagine. Her expression was a mask of fierce composure, hiding the fire that had erupted inside. She reached the stage and stepped directly into the blinding spotlight, a beacon of raw, unfiltered truth in a world of political performance. The moderator, caught completely off guard, made a feeble attempt to intervene, but Karoline simply held her ground, her presence commanding the space. There were no teleprompters, no prepared remarks, just fury and facts boiling over. The room was tense, some leaning forward in disbelief, others nervously glancing at their neighbors, as if to confirm that this was, in fact, really happening. She began to speak, her voice low and measured, a stark contrast to the emotional fire behind her eyes. When a man who claimed to represent hope resorts to mocking someone's marriage, she said, her words slicing through the heavy air, maybe it's time we ask what hope really looks like. The rhetorical jab hit with surgical precision. The room was stunned. Some journalists stopped scribbling, others leaned forward, their faces a mix of shock and intrigue. Then she hit harder, transitioning from a challenge of philosophy to a personal, unshakable defense. Her voice, though not loud, cut deep, carrying the weight of a truth that had been carelessly dismissed. "Mr. Obama, my husband is not a what?" she demanded, her question echoing in the profound silence. "He's a veteran, a teacher, a father. He's exactly the kind of man your administration forgot." A collective gasp rippled across the studio, a sound of profound shock and realization. Her words weren't a political argument. They were a moral indictment. The laughter that had followed Obama's quip was now a distant memory, replaced by the weight of her words. This was no longer about policy or politics as usual. The debate had been reframed in an instant. This was about dignity. And with a few simple, powerful sentences, Karoline had just flipped the script, live, unfiltered, and unafraid. She had taken his stage and turned it into a battleground for a more fundamental truth.
As the last echoes of her searing defense of her husband faded, a new energy took hold. The air in the room grew heavier, no longer just tense, but thick with the weight of a monumental confrontation. Karoline, standing tall under the blinding lights, was not content with merely defending her family. She had taken his platform and was now turning it into a courtroom. And in that courtroom, Barack Obama was the one on trial. With the purposeful grace of a prosecutor building a case, she began to pace slowly across the stage. She wasn't just addressing a political rival. She was addressing a legacy. "You called for unity," she began, her voice gaining authority, "but spent 8 years deepening divides. You said you'd protect working families, but left them drowning in red tape. You inspired millions and then abandoned them for Hollywood interviews and Netflix deals." The cameras flashed, reporters frantically tapped at their keyboards, and on social media, clips were already trending. Her words weren't speculative, they were a direct and unsparing review of a presidency she believed had failed its core promises. But the most devastating blow was yet to come. Karoline paused, allowing the tension to marinate in the room, then she did something unexpected. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded photograph. Holding it high for all to see, she turned it toward the cameras. "This is my husband," she declared, her voice now charged with emotion. "The man your former president thought was funny enough to mock." The photo, though small, held a universe of meaning. A young man in uniform beside a Black Hawk helicopter, dirt on his face and courage in his eyes. He wasn't a joke. He was a hero who carried wounded soldiers out of Fallujah. Mr. Obama, while you were sipping lattes with donors in Beverly Hills, he was dodging mortar fire. A collective gasp spread across the studio like a wave. Even the unflappable moderator swallowed hard. In a moment of sheer political instinct, Obama cleared his throat and tried to de-escalate. "Karoline," he said, his tone an attempt at paternal calm, "let's not make this personal." It was the wrong move. Her eyes narrowed and she fired back with a ferocity that left no room for doubt. It became personal the moment you mocked the people who make this country run. The moment you decided that marriage vows, military service, and middle America were punchlines for cocktail parties. The tension in the room didn't just build, it shattered into raw silence. No applause, no booing, just shock. And with a master strategist's timing, she pivoted. "But let's take a step back. Let's talk about legacy, shall we?" The reckoning had just begun. The raw silence that followed Karoline's pivot was more profound than any applause could have been. It wasn't the silence of shock anymore. It was a stillness born of revelation. The audience, previously a collection of individuals, now seemed to move as a single, breathing entity. Eyes that had once been fixed on the former president, a familiar and comforting center of gravity, were now locked onto her. The political decorum had been shattered, and in its place was a live, unfiltered confrontation that felt less like a debate and more like a generational reckoning. Karoline stood her ground, her voice unwavering as she widened her focus from the personal insult to the broader ideological chasm she felt it represented. "You spoke about hope," she began, her gaze never leaving Obama, but to half the country, that hope felt like mockery. We were told we were clinging to our faith, our families, our values, as if those were things to be ashamed of. The crowd stirred, not with tension, but with a new, quiet recognition. Journalists in the front row, whose pens had momentarily stalled, began frantically typing. Viewers at home leaned in, sensing that this was no longer a political skirmish, but a defining moment for an entire movement. For a brief, telling instant, Obama blinked, his lips slightly parted as if to interrupt, but Karoline pressed forward, a force of nature that could not be stopped. She spoke of her husband, the man who didn't serve because he wanted recognition, but because he believed in a country she felt had been left behind. She painted a vivid picture of a leadership more concerned with poetry than with the everyday struggles of working overtime, raising families. Her words didn't need to be shouted. They carried the force of a tidal wave, crashing down on the edifice of a legacy built on what she believed were empty promises. Obama leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight. The smooth, easygoing politician was gone, replaced by a man who was clearly unused to being dismantled with such surgical precision. His trademark smirk had faded, his usual charisma dimmed, and for the first time that night, he appeared shaken. He attempted to regain composure, but the room had already shifted. The applause that followed her next declaration was slow and tentative at first, but it grew into a strong, unwavering rhythm, not of political agreement, but of respect. It was the sound of an audience waking up to a truth they didn't know they needed to hear. "We're not the fringe," she said, her voice now a powerful crescendo of certainty. "We're the future." This wasn't a debate anymore. This was a generational shift, and Karoline had just given it a face.
The applause that filled the room was not a final act, but a transition. It was a roar that signaled a generational shift, a wave of recognition that Karoline had given a voice to millions who felt unseen. As the sound slowly tapered off, she stood tall, composed, but not cold. She wasn't gloating. She was holding the moment, allowing her truth to settle over the shattered remnants of the debate. Obama, no longer the center of gravity, adjusted his posture, still composed, but no longer in command. The stage was hers now. "You once said, 'We are the change we've been waiting for,'" she began, locking eyes with him one final time. Her voice was steady, the anger from earlier now tempered by an unshakable clarity. But somewhere along the way, that message stopped, including people like me. You inspired a generation to speak up, to dream big. But when those dreams didn't match your blueprint, we became the enemy, the ones you mock, the ones you dismiss. She raised a hand, not to silence him, but to emphasize her point. But we're not going anywhere. In fact, we're growing. There it was. Not bitterness, not anger, but a simple, profound statement of fact. I believe in an America where dissent isn't silenced, where questioning authority isn't dangerous, but necessary. Her voice rose, not in volume, but in authority. You don't have to agree with me, but you're going to have to deal with the fact that we're here now, loud, unapologetic, and informed. Obama leaned forward slightly, nodding, not in agreement, but in recognition of the undeniable shift in the room's energy. This wasn't a debate anymore. This was a generational shift, and Karoline had just given it a face. "We are not the fringe, we're the future," she said, her final words hanging in the air with the weight of a decree. "And we're not asking for permission." The crowd rose to their feet, this time not out of shock or political sides, but with a momentum that felt like an awakening. She gave one final glance to the audience, then to the camera, and a faint smile touched her lips, with steel behind it. "Because I'm not done talking." The music swelled faintly,
as the screen slowly faded to black. And in that final frame, with millions still processing what they just witnessed, one question lingered in the air. Was this just a viral moment or the start of something much bigger? Tonight wasn't just about a debate. It wasn't about right versus left or old versus young. It was about who owns the future of this country. And Karoline Leavitt made it clear. She's not waiting for permission to speak, to lead, or to fight back. Whether you agree with her or not, one thing's undeniable. She showed up with facts, fire, and the kind of fearless conviction that can't be silenced. Barack Obama may have mocked her marriage, but Karoline dismantled something far bigger, the illusion that her generation would stay quiet. After tonight, no one will ever look at her the same way again. If you were captivated by the story, make sure to like and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more moments of unfiltered truth, and tell us in the comments what you think about this epic clash of legacies.